Why do you think the SEC is doing this?
Gary.
And why do you think Gary's doing this?
Gary wants more power.
But what actual power is this? Is this
So
post SEC job?
I'll give you a little background on Gensler.
I mean, he's a shitcoiner himself. What was he promoting?
I don't know.
So when he was at the CFTC, I've talked to people. He was like a crypto evangelical person to the SEC back in the day.
Well,
so he
people
was
were really excited when he came in because of the talks he did was at MIT,
including me. I listened to hours of his classes to like, all right, this guy. I learned stuff from him about how some blockchain works.
And the CFTC always seemed a bit more open to this. I mean, Brian Quintenz was great. Who was the other guy? The
Giancarlo?
Yeah, Giancarlo.
Yeah.
I got this great photo of me. I went to the CFTC to interview Brian. I've got a great photo of me in front of the big plaque. It's me, Brian Quintenz. What's his name? Giancarlo in a Motorhead shirt in front of it. I got to show you it.
That's awesome.
But they were, when I met both of them, they're brilliant.
Yeah.
They're totally pro Bitcoin.
Yeah. It's funny. You talk, so like, this is going to get a little off topic, but I was shocked. So like anyone who's talked with the SEC, most of the I don't want to say the underlings, but the people you don't see giving press conferences, like when you talk to them, they know what's going on. Like people on Twitter were like, oh, the SEC doesn't understand this. And then like, I had calls with them. Like we had calls about ETFs and we're like, can we ask about what's going on with Bitcoin? And obviously have a conversation and like, they know what's going on. They're not completely oblivious. It's mostly coming right now. It's coming from top down from Gary, and Gary wants to be Secretary of Treasury. That's his ultimate goal. And he's basically tied himself in with the left wing of the Democratic Party. Think Elizabeth Warren types. So he needs them to be on his side if he ever wants to be Treasury Secretary. So he's tied in with them now.
Has he actually said he wants to be Treasury Secretary?
It's an open secret, but but I've heard from more than enough people that know him that that's his ultimate goal.
What happens when Trump wins the next election?
Well, it's funny. He was actually, I think he was the CFO of Hillary Clinton's campaign for 2016, and he was in line to become Treasury Secretary. Like if Clinton won, he was probably going to be Treasury Secretary, and we wouldn't have him as chairman of the SEC right now. So that he lost there, and then he went to MIT, and now he's back, and he's chairman of the SEC.
See, this is where it's absolute fucking bullshit. Because this is, I mean, it's just basic career. He's putting his entire career above what is best for the people of America.
He would disagree with you, but
of course he will.
Yeah.
Of course he will. But you've seen the MIT classes. We have. He was everyone used to talk about Gary Gensler's bags. Gary Gensler's bags to the moon. And yet right now, he doesn't seem to be doing much. It's almost like he's trying to just delay. He's delaying his tactic.
What he's doing, he's regulating through enforcement rather than regulating through like dialogue with the market, which is you'll hear from everyone. And what he wants to do is get more power at the SEC. That's what he did at the CFTC. When he was chairman of the CFTC, so this is fun fact, they weren't unionized until he became the chairman of the CFTC. So the people who work at the CFTC unionized underneath him because of how hard he was working them. So he's doing the same thing to people at the SEC. There's people leaving the SEC left and right because of him. He's hard to work for, basically, is the gist I've gotten from anyone I've spoken to.
And what kind of checks and balances are in for somebody in that role?
It's the courts, which he's going to the courts to do. So basically, one of his tactics is, you'll see this. He'll put out these applications or like notes for comment on like what he wants to do, rule changes, what have you. And he'll often put like one or two things in there that are just like absurd and has everyone up in arms. But really there's like a third or fourth thing in there that also is a little bit extenuous. But then he comes back later on after dialogues and comments and it's like, we're taking this out. And then everyone kind of forgets about this other thing that he slipped in there in some different way. So he's a textbook politician. Like he's a politician through and through. Like that is what this guy is. So he does a lot of different things like that.
He's a fucking snake, man. Yeah. Okay. So, and just so people understand the US political structure here. So he is a part of the Biden administration in that role. If Trump was to win the next election, all those roles, the heads of all those institutions changes, right?
Theoretic, yeah, he could ask for them to like. So I'm not an expert on this. I don't know 100%, but I believe that's correct. And he could keep them on, or he could ask them to resign, essentially, and then put somebody else in their place.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure when I was at the SEC, I actually saw the Hester Peirce thing in her office where it was her being appointed by Donald Trump. I'm pretty sure. I think that's what it is. That goes back to that Michael Lewis Fifth Wrist thing where you bring in
Yes, exactly.
they bring in their own team. Okay, so Gensler's basically playing power games that's stopping all this. Okay, so just say they lose the lawsuit, and if the judges are tough enough, they might be forced to allow it?
Theoretically, or what could happen, which is a fringe case, which has been discussed on it's been discussed on Twitter and through different people. The main thing that this hinges on is you allowed futures ETF, because the one thing that the SEC continually says they want, I think like the last denial of the GBTC, there was like 88 references to the term surveillance sharing agreements. Like they want NYSE to have surveillance sharing agreements with, or New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, wherever it lists, with an underlying exchange, a couple exchanges, a market of significant size. So like think, Binance, Gemini, Coinbase, like surveillance sharing agreements. So every single microsecond of trade that they can see to like look for manipulation. That's what the SEC wants. So then they can go to NYSE, who's regulated with them, and see it. Or they want those underlying exchanges to come on board and become exchanges themselves, so that they're also regulated. So it's either surveillance sharing agreements, give us all your data, or come in and become fully regulated with the SEC. So basically, they approve futures ETFs because the CME, where the Bitcoin futures trade, is a regulated market. So the SEC was like, all right, this is regulated. I'm going to toot my own horn a little bit here. We got shit on when we said that these were going to get approved. We stuck our necks out in August because basically in late July, Gary gave a speech, and like a couple lines in the speech, he was like, we look forward to 1940 Act applications of Bitcoin futures products. And like basically all you have to do right now is listen to what Gary Gensler says, because what he says is what he does. Like everything else kind of like matters, but it's like it's moved down in the totem pole. And that's why we got it right that Bitcoin futures ETFs were going to be approved when they were approved, and most other people were incorrect, even though they told us we were going to be wrong. So that's when I got like all of my followings, because I was aggressive in saying we thought it was going to get approved, and that's when most people followed me. But all of this hinges on the fact that Bitcoin futures ETFs were approved. There's a non-0% chance that Gensler could go back and say, all right, then we're just going to delist Bitcoin futures ETFs, which then would open another APA violation and lawsuit and go in the courts, because the issuers are like, you can't just approve and then disapprove. But there's some talk of that happening. I don't think it's going to happen, but that's another outcome there. Like I said, I think the most common outcome is the judges say, you violated the APA, go back to the drawing board, either approve or deny for a different reason, and then they're going to deny them, possibly because they've done all the stuff with custodians, regulated custodians. I think they might lean on that a little bit. I'm not really sure.
Okay, just say they do allow it through the judges. They are forced to allow this. How quickly can the GBTC trust become an ETF? And also, what positions does this put all the other applications in? The Valkyrie, the Winklevoss one? Because there's lots of applications, but really first to market is what you want.
Yeah, so that's a good question. We kind of have to get into the 33 Act versus the 40 Act to answer that question. So there is this new rule called the ETF rule filed in 2019. And basically, if you're a 1940 Act ETF, you file, and then after 75 days, you can launch. It basically makes launching an ETF easier. 1940 Act has additional protections. Basically, it was created afterwards with more protection. You need a board, you need XYZ. 1933 Act ETFs, which is what the gold ETFs are, what spot Bitcoin ETFs can only be. They don't have all the same stuff, but it's really just, it's a very minute differences. Like for the most part, 99.9% of the time, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. But for futures ETFs, they can be either 40 Act or 33 Act. 33, you can use a little more leverage to be a little bit more efficient. But it's basically because treasuries can either be cash or a security as far as the SEC and regulation is worked, because that's just, you can basically file it as either cash or as security. And if you file it as a security, then it's a diversified investment. So basically, if you use treasuries as your security, you can file as a 40 Act. That means 75 days after you file, unless the SEC comes in and says, withdraw, you can't do this, we won't allow it, you just launch. The other option, which is the only way to launch a spot Bitcoin ETF, which is the way that like all the gold ETFs, a lot of other ETFs are launched, is under the 33 Act. And they have to go through this process called the 19B4, which is where you see all those has been disapproved, which is whatever. So they go through this process, and it's like a 240-ish day process from filing, and they extend, whatever. So they either accept right away after 40, I don't know exactly what the days are, but it's 240 total, and there's like 5 steps in between or 4 steps in between, and they either extend or approve. And then at the end of 240, they either approve or deny, and then they deny. The only active application right now for spot Bitcoin ETF is ARK, Cathie Wood's ARK in 21 shares, which launched a bunch of ETFs in Europe. So they have a ton of crypto ETFs across Europe, primarily in Switzerland. So they just filed not that long ago. So that's the only active spot Bitcoin application. There is a 33 Act ETF, which was critical in the lawsuit that Grayscale brought against the SEC. I don't know if I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but essentially the first spot Bitcoin ETFs were approved, and basically they leaned on the fact that it was a 40 Act product instead of a 33. But then there were already filings for a 33 Act Bitcoin futures ETF that came due in March of 2022. So the SEC basically was forced to approve that because, like, what were they going to say? Oh, one's a 40 Act, one's a 33 Act. So they approved the futures ETFs under the 33 Act. Basically, it's all these issuers whittling away at all these different reasons for them denying. So they're now, so Tucrium was the one that filed that, and they ended up selling it to a company called Hashdex, they're in the US, but primarily in Brazil. And they bought that ETF. So now there's a 33 Act Bitcoin futures ETF, DeFi. Theoretically, they could alter things, and if they allow for spot Bitcoin ETFs, that might be the first spot Bitcoin ETF because it's already a 33 Act. And so that theoretically they could alter things in their prospectus. I'm not 100% certain of that, but I think they could alter it to buy spot Bitcoin. I don't know how long it would take. It could take months. It could take weeks. I would guess months if they get approved and they can convert it to an ETF. Honestly, the best thing for everyone involved, in my opinion, would be for ETF approval. You don't want them forced liquidation because then they're going to have to sell a ton of Bitcoin.
Nobody wants that.
You don't want them to stay where they are. ETF approval is best for everyone. Just Bitcoin holders directly, GBTC holders. It's just a more efficient vehicle for anyone who wants to trade these things. Right now, everyone's trading the Bitcoin futures ETFs if you want to trade on traditional financial markets. So yeah, the best situation would be for them to convert to an ETF, but I don't see it happening anytime soon.
But back to my point, though, you want to be the first ETF, right? Because that becomes the most liquid market.
For the most part. So we saw in Canada, one ETF launched one day before the others. Right, so this ETF launch, it's the Purpose BTCC launched in Canada. It launched literally one day before all the other ones. It's spot Bitcoin ETF up there, and it dwarfs everything else for the most part in trading volume. It dwarfs in assets, but there's a lot of assets in some other ones, but they don't trade anywhere near as much. So one day advantage is critical. We were of the opinion that you should just allow like a bunch of these to line up at the starting line and go at the same time. Exactly. But that's not how the SEC works. They're not. I don't think they're going to do that.
How many ETFs, spot ETFs, do we know of for Bitcoin there are globally?
Spot.
I mean, just estimate. Are we talking like 5, 50?
No, more than that. 15, maybe more. But okay. There's like 180 something crypto ETFs or ETPs. I'll call them. There's ETNs, ETCs. We don't have to get into nuances.
Fundamentally the same
for the most part. They're technically a debt instrument, but a lot of them are spot backed, so they actually hold the assets. The difference is like some of the really cheap ones in Europe. The reason they're super cheap is because they lend them out. So like the reason some of these are more expensive is because they're not lending out the underlying Bitcoin. So like if you're buying a super cheap ETF, they're probably lending out the underlying assets in some way and earning return on it. Now that's very common in the ETF world. So like I'm going to talk traditional finance a bit, but like you can basically get virtually free access to the US financial markets or any market using like a Vanguard ETF or iShares ETF, because what they do is like they charge 3 basis points, 0.03%. And then they'll also lend out the underlying. So they earn a little bit of return. So like basically your net expense, like they're taking this money, but they're also earning on lending out shares. And you end up paying virtually nothing, even less than what the expense ratio is many times because you're lending it out. But obviously we know the issues with lending out underlying crypto, Bitcoin, what have you. So some of these ETFs are doing that, but they're probably, I'm going to hope and assume they're doing it in a more efficient manner than some of these other guys we've seen.
But basically, US investors are being disadvantaged against other international investors.
Yes, not even close.
Yeah.
Not up for an argument.
Yeah, bad. Okay, interesting. Okay, so when's the lawsuit being heard? You said there's oral arguments. When do we expect a decision by?
So now we'll expect a decision. The rough estimate is towards the end of 2Q and into 3Q, which is before the end of June is possible. It's likely going to be a 3Q decision. So July, August, September, somewhere in that time range. There's no like this many days until the judges issue a statement, right? There's no guaranteed, but it's my guess would be sometime in the third quarter. So summer.
These markets are very heavily regulated. Are they over-regulated?
Which markets?
All of everything. FTC, the CFTC, the SEC.
That's a real nuanced question. So we can get this is a good thing to ask. The SEC, which people have probably said, some regulators are merit regulators. Is there merit behind this investment? The SEC is not a merit regulator, which, to be honest, that's what they're doing with Bitcoin, right? They're saying there is no merit to this investment, in my opinion. A lot of their decisions, why they didn't deny it. What the SEC is a disclosure regulator. They're supposed to say, disclose everything to us, which is what all these companies do. And when you don't disclose everything, it's securities fraud. So like, there's I'm blanking on his name, but there's a columnist in Bloomberg, and he says everything is securities fraud. Like if you do one thing and it's said differently in your documents, you committed securities fraud. So basically, that's what the SEC does. They can go over anyone. Basically, if you lie and do something different with whatever however you're operating, right? So their whole goal is like disclose all the risks, disclose everything you're doing, and we'll be good, which is what they should be doing. If everyone knows the risk at this point of what Bitcoin is, like this isn't 2015 anymore. Like people understand what it is. I mean, little side note, the Winklevoss tried to launch an ETF back in 2013 when Bitcoin was $100. Like this has been going on. This list is every ETF that has been filed in the US.
Holy shit. What is there, like 50 on here?
No, 79.
79.
And I'm probably missing some.
Huh,
and one of those was filed today. But you asked about the first to market thing. If you look at the bottom, see all the dates on the filing for all those Ethereum futures ETFs?
Yeah.
Grayscale filed for those 3 ETFs I mentioned. And the next day, 3 issuers filed. And then your buddy Steve at Valkyrie filed also a couple days later because they don't want to be late, right? Like even if it's likely or potentially likely that the SEC is going to not allow them to launch these, but in the off chance that they do allow it, you can't be 75 days behind. You have to just file and go for it, right? Like you can't let somebody else launch and beat you to market by 70 plus days.